G'day guys and gal. An absolute donkey load of Space Marines died during the Horus Heresy and subsequent scouring. I would say easily over half, maybe even 2/3. This is why the traitors didn't do anything for ages after the Heresy, because there was barely any left alive. And it's also the reason why the Loyalists went from mighty legions to cute little chapters. But how many losses did each legion actually suffer? It definitely wasn't equal across the board. Losses ranging from 99% borderline extinction all the way to, oh what, there was a civil war? It's one of the only times GW likes to give us concrete numbers about stuff, so let's take advantage of that. Before we get started, Manscaped, the hygiene giveth and hair taketh brand we all know and love. They know how to offer value. You can literally stack discounts upon discounts with Manscaped. Today's offer is no different as I present the Groin and Go bundle. Easily my two favorite Manscaped products in one value pack. Sure, the Manscaped body wash has you smelling manly and fine, and the Plow 2.0 will give you a skin tight shave that only a single bladed razor can offer, but the Handyman and Lawnmower 5.0 is unbeatable. The lawnmower will keep everything below the neck clear and shaved, including under the armpits that I recommend every man do every few months. After all, most body odor is due to the hairs of the armpits getting saturated in dry sweat. The more you know. And yes, the lawnmower will keep the old cock and balls clean. What, we're all adults here, I can say that. The Handyman on the other hand is perfect for the face, especially the neck. My protocol is lawnmower for the chest, armpits and family jewels, which leaves me with 0 razor bumps or red marks, and then I do the Handyman for the neck. Then I also have another dedicated beard trimmer from a different brand for the face. I'm not gonna lie to you and pretend everything I use is Manscaped, it's not. But I genuinely do use the Handyman and Lawnmower. By getting this bundle, you're saving 19% over getting the items separately, but then using my link, you'll stack another 20% off on top of that and free international shipping. Cheers to Manscaped for sponsoring this video. Today we'll go over each Space Marine's losses over the course of the Horus Heresy, and maybe just a little bit after it to determine just how many Space Marines actually died. Let's get into it. The Horus Heresy was a huge deal for a few reasons. Firstly, it was brother against brother, a war of love turned into hate, betrayal of the worst kind, and secondly, it showed the Space Marine legions as not actually fallible, but indeed very killable. Sure, a lot of Space Marines died during the Great Crusade, but only small fractions here and there other than the occasional turbo shit, like the rung-dung xenocides, but even those weren't too bad. The Heresy on the other hand, man, bang bang, scrit scrit, not good, but let's begin. The Dark Angels were a powerhouse, so much so that Horus sent the Lion and his warriors far away and then had the Night Lord slow them down purely to try keep them out of the way for as long as possible. Horus had no interest in directly fighting the Lion. Because of this, the Dark Angels suffered actually quite few casualties in comparison to the other legions. Sure, they lost a few thousand against the Night Lords, but those were mostly skirmishes until the Lion turbo fucked the Night Lords and wiped out a quarter of their legion in one decisive battle. After that, the Dark Angels destroyed Traitor Worlds, helped Sanguinius get to Terra, and did a few other things, but nothing that incurred that many casualties. To be honest, they probably lost the most when they returned to Caliban and were fired upon by the Fallen. Overall, their losses would be around 10 to 20% of their total legion, not much. The Emperor's children were at the forefront of a lot of engagements. The Isfahan Dropside Massacre, the Angel Exterminatus, the Void Battle against the White Scars, not to mention they were one of the main forces that battled the Shattered Legions. While they didn't suffer a lot of casualties in a single engagement, they did lose a fuckload of Marines over the course of these skirmishes as they were always too arrogant and too eager. I'd say they lost about a third from purging their loyalists, including the subsequent battle against said loyalists, but then after that they didn't actually lose too many during the Dropsite Massacre itself. However, they probably lost another fifth or so from the many skirmishes with the Iron Hands, in which the Iron Hands usually won. While they were at the Siege of Terra, they spent a lot of their time attacking the civilian populace rather than grinding up against the palace's defenses, so their casualties were probably the lowest out of all the traitors present there. This explains why they were the most powerful traitor legion post-Heresy, a title they lost when Abaddon came back into the scene and stomped on their balls. All up, I'd say they lost a little bit less than half their legion during the Heresy, but then lost most of the legion when Abaddon returned. The Iron Warriors weren't as arrogant and easy to exploit as the Emperor's children, but they still got their asses spanked here and there. During the Battle of Fal, the brilliant Imperial fist Alexis Pollux was actually winning the Void War and was killing thousands of Iron Warriors, with him only losing because Rogel Dawn issued a desperate retreat order. Then there was the Battle of Talan, a grueling planet-wide tank battle that amazingly saw the Iron Warriors defeated, suffering thousands more casualties in the process. We also can't forget the Schadenhold, where Warsmith Dantioch skull-fucked his traitorous kin to death. The Iron Warriors would fight hard in the siege, but Perturabo would often send other legions' warriors into suicide attacks and potential traps rather than his own men, as a way to say fuck you to his brothers for being so useless. He would then leave the siege midway, resulting in the Iron Warriors not actually losing many warriors during the Heresy, easily less than a quarter of the legion throughout the entire war. It's hard to say how many they would then lose during the Iron Cage, but not as much as the Imperial Fists. The White Scars an interesting one. They were cut off from Terra and surrounded by traitors, using their very unique strategies and battle doctrine to constantly hit and run the Death Guard, Sons of Horus, and Emperor's Children that were hunting them. Over the course of 4 years, they lost 1/5 of the Legion, but inflicted probably over twice as many casualties, but it wasn't enough. Not to mention they also had to purge the traitors from their ranks via sending them on suicide missions, or just straight up executing them, so that's a few more thousand. The Scars were actually able to give their hunters the slip, after killing a fuck ton more of them, before making their way back to Terra with just under 4/5 of their original Legion strength, so probably around 70 to 80,000. They would suffer massive casualties during the Siege of Terra as one of the 3 legions defending it, probably around 80% or more. However, as they have a healthy amount of successor chapters, a fair few thousand survived. The Space Wolves were their own worst enemy during the Heresy, and they suffered a massive amount of deaths. Firstly, they lost 23,000 Marines on Prospero, then they were attacked by the Alpha Legion and lost thousands more, then they launched a pretty retarded attack on the Sons of Horus, in which they lost even more, before they were stranded on Yarant and surrounded by traitor forces and attacked, while Leman Russ was wounded and unable to help, which, then lost them thousands more. They were going to die. However, Corvus Corax arrived and saved them, but by this point, the Legion had lost 4 out of 5 wolves, going some way to explaining why the wolves were never forced to have successor chapters. There just wasn't enough of them left to do so. Also, they're wolves and they don't follow the rules. Sadly, this wasn't even the highest amount of casualties a Loyalist Legion would suffer during the Heresy. The Imperial Fist spent most of the Heresy on Terra, preparing its defenses. However, Alexis Pollux did take a third of the Legion to take the war to the traitors, almost wiping out the Iron Warriors in the process. However, pretty much that entire 1/3 would die, either during the Battle of Fal or subsequent Imperium Secundus Wars. There was also the Battle of Pluto, but that was actually a stomp for the Imperial Fists, with them losing only a few thousand at most. The Imperial Fists would suffer a lot of deaths during the siege, with the survivors then nearly being destroyed during the events of the Iron Cage after the Heresy. They were so decimated by the end of that their numbers went from around 100,000 pre-Heresy to around 4,000 post-Scouring, based on how many successors they formed. The Night Lords took some fat dick in the ass during the Heresy, firstly because they were sent to fight the Dark Angels, which was a huge L for the Night Lords. The end of that war would result in over an entire quarter of the Night Lords Legion destroyed, as well as their first captain captured, and Conrad nearly killed like 4 times. Then when a large chunk of the Legion attacked the Faros device, that would result in dozens of thousands of Night Lord deaths. A few thousand made their way to Terra, which resulted in most of those Night Lords dying as well. Then to add insult to the injury, Conrad allowed himself to be assassinated, and then the world that most of the Legion was hiding on got attacked by the Ultramarines, which killed even more Night Lords and scattered the survivors. Now there are barely any Night Lords left, with their overall casualties ranging from 90 to 95% compared to what they were pre-Heresy. The Blood Angels went through some shit, but didn't actually lose many warriors until the Siege of Terra. Sure, there was Cygnus Prime, but by all accounts that was the Blood Angels turbo fucking demons to death, not the other way round, with their casualties being around 10% of the Legion at most. Sanguinius then did have to fight his way through the Ruin Storm, but this also wasn't a notable war zone for mass Blood Angel casualties. No, GW wanted the Blood Angels, Imperial Fists, and White Scars to be quite strong for the Siege of Terra to justify them holding off the might of most of the traitor legions. Whilst the siege was brutal and many sons of Sanguinius died, they also have a shitload of successor chapters, which indicates that many thousands of Blood Angels survived the siege. The Iron Hands were amongst the Shattered Legions, suffering around 85 to 90% casualties during the Dropsite Massacre. However, their cold logic and tenacity meant that a surprisingly large amount were actually able to escape, probably the most out of all the Shattered Legions. Thus, they were able to wage a pretty solid guerrilla war against the traitors. However, due to their aggression and lack of care for their own safety, this last 15% were whittled down to under 5% by the end of the Heresy, a few thousand Iron Hands at most, but boy oh boy did the traitors pay dearly for that. It's not a shocker that a fuckload of World Eaters died during the Heresy. The Isfahan Atrocity, the Dropsite Massacre, the Shadow Crusade, the Legion infighting due to their own insanity, and finally the Siege of Terra. The World Eaters were a large legion, so they could afford the losses, but those losses would easily amount to at least 75% of their original Legion strength. You'd think that number would be higher, but they didn't really lose many battles, nor did they ever rout, which is when most deaths occur in battle. However, this does go a fair way to explaining why true OG World Eaters are so rare in the current setting. Being a berserker for 10,000 years isn't good for your health. The Ultramarines had a rough start to the Heresy. They were ordered to muster with near full Legion strength on Calth, only to be ambushed by the Wordbearers. However, the Ultramarines are tough cookies, and they were the largest Legion, numbering around 250,000. Hence they survived Calth, but they did suffer over 100,000 deaths during that battle, the largest losses of any Legion. They would then lose many thousands more in the subsequent Shadow Crusade, where they fought against the World Eaters and Wordbearers in a 2v1. Despite suffering the most deaths out of all legions during the Heresy, the Ultramarines were still the largest post-Heresy, which is nuts to think about. They were also spared from the Siege of Terra or any other significant engagement after all the fuckery that happened in Ultramar. Needless to say, they have a fucking shitload of successor chapters. The Death Guard Guard did have a lot of initial casualties due to purging their loyalist elements, but until the Siege of Terror, they didn't actually suffer too many after that. Sure, they lost thousands against the White Scars and thousands more in their various skirmishes against the Shattered Legions, but they did come to the Siege of Terror with around 70% of their original Legion strength. The Death Guard were actually a huge issue for the loyalists, especially as they were now the wildly difficult to kill Plague Marines. They did suffer a lot during the siege, but with how hard they are to kill, many Death Guard survived, with the numbers in the current setting being even more than it was pre-Heresy. As a rough call, I'd say they lost around 50% of their Legion during the entire Heresy. None of the traitors got fucked harder during the Heresy than the Thousand Sons. They were already a pretty small Legion to begin with, but then they lost 90% of their Legion during the fall of Prospero. These survivors would then go to the planet of the Sorcerers, where many began falling to the flesh change or were just killed by their hostile environment. More would die trying to retrieve Magnus' soul shards. Magnus would then lead his final 9,000 sons to attack Terra to try to retrieve his final soul shard. More would die, but not that many. Overall, I would say 8,500 or so thousand sons survived the Heresy, only to then get turbo fucked by the Rubric of Ahriman, bringing the total true survivors to around 1,000. Makes sense. The Sons of Horus were a large legion, but they were also on the forefront of most battles during the Heresy, and they suffered greatly from the Loyalist Purge. They had lost over a third of their legion early on in the Heresy, but they were also recruiting like madmen to offset these losses. The war on Molech, the various skirmishes against the Shattered Legions, the attack by Lehman Russ, and the battle for Beta Garmin all saw the Sons of Horus getting down, dirty, and dead. But at most, these wars accounted for 10 to 20,000 casualties all up. The bulk of their forces would fight and die on Terra. The Sons of Horus suffered the most out of all the traitors during the siege, losing cohesion and being used as fodder by Perturabo and the other legions. Horus was too far gone by this point, drinking too much Kool-Aid to notice or care. Post-Heresy, the Sons of Horus were blamed by the other traitor legions for the failure of the Heresy, and they were repeatedly attacked, eventually causing Abaddon to dissolve the pitiful remains of the Legion, and from its ashes, the Black Legion was born. The Sons of Horus easily lost over 90% of their Legion during the Heresy. The Wordbearers were a very large legion, which allowed them to suffer a lot of casualties. Nearly all 50,000 Wordbearers sent to Calth died, with many thousands more dying in the Shadow Crusades. Lorgar tried to usurp Horus as War Master, but got his ass beat for the attempt, leading to he and most of his Legion quitting the war effort. A few thousand Wordbearers did go down to Terra, with most of them dying there. Overall, despite losing around 75,000 Marines, the Wordbearers were in pretty good shape after their Heresy due to their massive Legion size, about 50% total losses. The Salamanders got absolutely wrecked during the Heresy. Unlike the Iron Hands who escaped after Ferris's death, or the Raven Guard that fought through the traitors and escaped with Corvus, the Salamanders at Isfahan followed Vulcan, who then got clapped, so they got clapped as well. Only a few hundred Salamanders survived Isfahan and were scattered amongst other Shattered Legion warbands. However, most Shattered Legion groups were eventually killed. When Artellus Numion gets to Nocturne to try revive Vulcan, he is with a handful of surviving Marines, and he sees that Nocturne has a garrison of about 800 Salamanders, most of which being fresh recruits. All up, the Salamanders lost about 99% of their Legion during the Heresy, which is why they had no successor chapters post-Heresy. They quite literally didn't have enough Marines. The Raven Guard fared pretty well after the Dropside Massacre, comparatively. Corvus led a breakout in which a couple thousand Raven Guard were able to escape the killing field and would get rescued. Deliverance also had a decent garrison still on it. Many Raven Guard also managed to survive the drop site in small groups due to their stealth and speed. They did still lose 75,000 Marines on that day, about 90% of the Legion, but with their strong recruitment program, plus a few thousand cheeky Raptor Marines, the Raven Guard had around 7,000 Marines towards the end of the Heresy, enough to cause some damage to the traitors and split up into a healthy amount of successor chapters. The Alpha Legion is fucking huge, maybe even just as large as the Ultramarines, because there is no way they were able to suffer the casualties that they did and walk it off like it was nothing. They lost dozens of thousands at the Battle of Pluto, thousands against the Space Wolves, and had their hands in over a dozen different cookie jars. Sometimes they would try to eat their own cookie, but since they didn't touch the Siege of Terra and didn't commit in full to many engagements, more so just popping in, doing something weird and then getting smacked, they probably suffered the lowest amount of casualties out of all the legions, around a similar amount to the Dark Angels. So out of the roughly 2.4 million Space Marines that took a part in the Heresy, around 1.4 million-ish died. That's a number I did calculate, but I also didn't spend a lot of time calculating, so take it with a grain of salt. Regardless of the specifics, well over half of all Space Marines died, with the current setting having around 1.2 million loyalist Astartes running around, with a similar amount of traitors depending on the actual size of the Black Legion, more or less back to pre-Heresy numbers. If you enjoyed the video and you want to support the channel, then subscribe. We're a flick of a dick away from 600k, which also rhymes with you're gay. So yeah, subscribe. Join this call for more memes and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.